His name is Todd McFall. He's an assistant professor at Wake Forest University, published articles on sports and governance decisions by the NCAA. He teaches Introduction to Economics, Price Theory, and Sports and Economics over at Wake Forest. So without further ado, Todd, your opening statement.
So I wanted to first thank Dave, who's not in here, but for having me today. This is a great way to kind of break up the summer routine, come give a little talk at a conference, and also give the people what they want, which is listen to an economist talk at high noon on a Sunday. So I know everyone was looking forward to this. So I wanted to just start by giving you kind of an idea about how I've thought through the NIL issue since the Supreme Court handed down their decision on Alston, which is going about 2 years ago, I think in a couple days. When the decision was handed down, I immediately went into economist mode, and I kind of wondered the extent to which this was going to allow for athletic departments to see athletes as substitutes or complements, right? You might remember that from Econ 1, to their traditional revenue collection processes, right? So if they're complements, then they could increase revenue by having opportunities for athletes to have their own commercial interests and agreements. If there are substitutes, then their revenue processes are probably going to suffer a little bit. And 2 years on, the evidence that I have collected, and like right off the top, I should say, like I don't represent Wake Forest athletics here today. I don't represent the school of Wake Forest. I'm an economist who studies these things. I am not part of the Wake Forest decision-making apparatus when it comes to athletics. But from the evidence that I've seen, we can say that this is probably a substitute, that athletic departments feel like their revenues are taking a hit because traditional revenue lines and agreements are now being diverted over to athletes. And to the extent which is taking place is probably wildly variant across the schools. But from where I sit right now, the evidence suggests that these schools are seeing this as a bit of a substitute process for them. And I think the clearest indicator of this is the behavior that the schools are taking on, which is that they're going to Congress to lobby for legislation that is going to provide like a federal blanket law for NIL. I don't think they would be doing that if they felt like this was a good thing for their revenue collection processes. And so kind of how I think about this is taking a page from psychology or behavioral economics, which is that we all have reference points that we make with regards to how the future is going to look, like how a process is going to play out. In athletic departments for, what has it been? About 70 years since the gentleman's agreement was made and gave the NCAA regulatory authority over scholarship limits for payment for athletes. Their reference point was we have pretty much control over every aspect of the athletic endeavor here on campus. And it's hard to get rid of that reference point. And I think athletic departments are having a little bit of trouble getting rid of that reference point in their mind and thinking about how we can adjust to a world in which we don't have all the cards in our favor. So they're losing revenue, and losses hurt more than gains. If you are losing relative to what you thought, that's usually a situation where you get a little angrier, get a little more upset, and I think you're kind of seeing that with athletic departments right now as they go up to Washington D.C. and lobby lawmakers over this. So the next thing that I think the point I want to make here is that it's kind of related to this is how hard is the NCAA going to work to regulate this? Because the new guy there, Charlie Baker, who replaced Mark Emmert, has been fairly aggressive in his language that like the NCAA is going to police this. And there's a couple problems with this that I think are on the horizon for the NCAA. The first is the extent to which they're going to regulate this is going to anger some very important members who probably see NIL as a way to leverage success on the field. But the other thing they do is they start to rattle sabers of the Department of Justice. They start to rattle sabers of the Supreme Court. If you read the Supreme Court decision that Gorsuch wrote and that Kavanaugh concurred with, Gorsuch wrote an opinion that was very high-minded, full of legalese. Kavanaugh was the bulldog. And he said in no uncertain terms that this cannot go on anymore. And the extent to which the NCAA tries to regulate NIL, I think is going to be really interesting as to the power of regulatory behavior that the NCAA is going to have over its membership, but also whether or not there might be problems with the law. A couple more points I wanted to make here. A lot of people that I've talked to about this are lawyers, not economists. And of course, lawyers are going to think that having some sort of law is better than not. An economist is going to look at this and say, let's just let the markets happen. If I were making laws about this, the law that I would make is there is no law about NIL. So don't make state laws. State laws are going to be disregarded. That's that. Very close behind that would be a federal law that tries to create some sort of uniform playing field for NIL. Way down here are state laws that are highly variant with regards to how NIL is going to be policed. And that's just because federal laws can minimize kind of questions that athletes or athletic departments might have with regards to how this is going to be policed. State laws, if they're wildly variant, are probably going to harm athletes as well as place athletic departments at an advantage or disadvantage relative to other athletic departments in different states. And then the final point here, and there's a trial that's going on in federal court. Hearings were about a month and a half ago. Are these guys going to be workers? Are we going to consider athletes to be workers very soon? Right now they're not. That's a crossing of the Rubicon for the NCAA. But the harder the NCAA polices this, I think the more likely it is that you're going to see some action in the courts that basically say, look, these athletes are workers, and the treatment that you're seeing from athletic departments regarding them is out of bounds. And if I'm the NCAA, I really worry about that, and I, frankly, try to get a hold of it as soon as I can. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about how I think about this situation. Spencer was going to ask some questions, and
I have
let's
lots.
let it go. All right, go ahead.
This is such an interesting topic for me personally. I've introduced myself a few times here today, but what I failed to mention is that even after all my years of play-by-play announcing, I actually went back to school and got an MBA in marketing and entrepreneurship, which is really what NIL is for athletes. It's marketing themselves and entrepreneurship. You're a business owner. You're owning your likeness. And so I have lots of questions about some of the things that you asked. And my first one is going to be actually the last point you just made about employment. These guys are working, and gals are working a ton of hours, which would probably put them over the limit of being part-time employees. They would most likely either have to sign contracts and just be contractors, or full-time employees. So what would be the route that would be more beneficial to schools to take, and what would be the route that would be more beneficial to the athletes to take?
I think any athletic department, and again, like, I'm not speaking for an athletic department, this is just me reading the tea leaves and having an above understanding of how markets work. No athletic department wants to deal with this. I think some of them are probably ready to deal with it. There's probably about 60 athletic departments around the country that I think tomorrow could probably deal with this really well. but they don't want to have to deal with the athletes as workers because it's going to be more expensive to hire them than what it is to retain them on scholarship. They will probably have to deal with unions, right? The athletes could unionize. I don't want to gloss over that point. That's a really difficult step. And if you want to understand how difficult it is, Starbucks workers at various locations are trying to unionize right now. And Starbucks is essentially slow rolling that process. The Supreme Court under Roberts has made it much more difficult to unionize during his tenure over various cases that they've heard. This is not a small point. It's not like if they were made athletes that a union would form right away. But they don't want to have to deal with the unions. Labor sharing agreements or risk sharing agreements. So how much am I going to have to work? How much am I going to have to pay you? Those are the sorts of questions that would have to be hammered out either individually or collectively. And right now, even though NIL, I think, is cutting into the revenues that schools are earning, they're not having to cut checks that are very big right now for these workers, which means that the workers are carrying the burden of risk right now. And I don't think the athletic departments want to do that. My guess is that the athletes would be uncertain about it. Certainly some of the ones that I've talked to at Wake Forest are a little bit uncertain about what that would mean. But I think if you bring them on as a stakeholder into college athletics, as opposed to someone who's just kind of passing through, I think for the most part they'd find that to be advantageous to them. Certainly in football and men's basketball, that would be the case, I would say, and I was in the panel last hour. Women's basketball is growing by leaps and bounds. I would think that many women basketball players would find this to be advantageous. The problem that you would then start to see, because football players, men's basketball players, I mean, their value is just larger than any other athlete on campus, is where do the revenues go for the other teams? And there's a sports historian at Arizona State named Victoria Jackson who makes a great point about this. And her point is very simple. When Title IX was handed down, and the way she says this is, when Title IX was handed down, those who made that legislation didn't mean for football players to subsidize the women's soccer team. Right? It's unfair for us to suggest that the football players who drive the revenue sources for the schools subsidize the men's swimming team at State Tech U. Now, there are other revenue channels for those teams to explore. They can change around the model of how they produce games. They can change around the model of how they collect revenues. But like right now, it's wildly unfair that we ask these football players, most of whom are black, like let's be explicit about that, to accept less than market value for their wages and to have that money subsidize other places. So that's a long answer, which you'd expect from an economist, that suggests that if I were to look 10 years into the future, I think they'd probably see a lot of schools recognizing these folks as athletes. There's some sort of unionization that occurs, and probably what we think of as like Division I football is in 2 or 3 new leagues, just like the NCAA went through 40 years ago when it went into Division I, II, and III.
So you're mentioning something there that has to do with the amount of available money per school and athletic department from donor bases, from businesses, as well as size of school. So you're at a very interesting institution. Wake Forest has a lot of available money relative to a lot of NCAA schools. However, one of the smallest populations, which in turn means one of the smallest alumni bases, and yet it has to compete with large state institutions that produce a lot more alumni that could then turn around and give more money. So how does a school like a Wake Forest, or even let's drop down to maybe an FCS school, how do they compete in this landscape when there's less available dollars and players could make more money potentially being the 10th guy on the bench at a larger school?
I think if you treat these folks as athletes, and there is some sort of like blanket contract, this would be to me the real benefit of moving forward towards calling these folks workers and unionizing, is that you could create blanket contracts that would make the kid at Alabama earn the same salary as someone at Wake Forest, that would give Appalachian State a chance to sign a number of players for the same value as someone like Georgia. But that being said, like I just mentioned, like employment is about risk. It's about risk sharing. And smaller schools, if they have a smaller alumni base, if they have fewer alums, are going to have a hard time spreading that risk over a smaller number of people. So it'd be really difficult, but it'd be really difficult for a Wake Forest to, it's already really difficult for a Wake Forest to compete against North Carolina. It's already really difficult for a Wake Forest to compete against NC State. It would probably be harder, but like then again, my view is that if your business model exists on being able to pay people less than what their market value is worth, then that's a business model that we probably don't need in the United States.
Go ahead and take a question from the audience.
Well, you may have already answered it, but how would what you're saying, if App State would pay the same thing as UGA, how is that not wage suppression?
If a union agrees to a collective bargaining agreement, then I would say that it's wage suppression, but it's agreed upon. Like LeBron James has never made his fair market value in the NBA. And that's because the collective bargaining agreement mandates that he not do that because the owners don't want to get into a bidding war over his skills. So the owners and the players have agreed to a collective bargaining agreement that essentially handcuffs them from that bidding. So I would anticipate, and again, this is like me being an economist, like I'm not in the room on this. I would anticipate that what you'd see is a union negotiation that says, look, you can have so many players paid this, you can have so many players paid this, you can have so many players paid this. I could be wrong about that, but almost any league that has a collective bargaining agreement suppresses wages from someone in that league. And that's just the way that it's been since free agency came about. What's that been, 48 years ago?
Could we see a salary cap by conference?
Sure.
Let's say the MEAC can't afford what an ACC school can afford. So if you're going to put the same salary cap out there, I mean, you're not comparing apples to apples.
Yeah, absolutely. You could have you could have union negotiations by state, you could have union negotiations by conference, you could have national union negotiations. So then you'd have different agreements hammered out by each geographic entity. So that's a valid point. It's a valid point that says that there might be wage suppression that would occur if they're actually paid by the schools, but they're not right now because the schools are leveraging what they have to not get into that sort of risk.
We'll go back, and then Michael, you're up next.
As a Wake Forest fan, I like the notion of leveling the playing field somewhat, but the fact is Wake waited a year to go with the NIL, is now trying to do a collective that's like $3 million a year. They know they're going to be under-resourced. But if you ever had unions, if you ever had conferences with kind of an agreement, wouldn't the bigger school just go right back to paying under the table? Because Wake waited a year and they said other schools didn't have to
So, you're, I don't want to say you're like conflating two issues here, but like NIL right now, I think the worry of the NCAA is that NIL is going to be used as a backdoor way, and the worry that I know Wake Forest has is that NIL is going to be a backdoor way to get athletes onto campus that are going to potentially win games. Like, that's what happens with the New York Yankees. Like, that's what happens with the LA Dodgers. That's not going to be any different than what we see in Major League Baseball. It's not going to be any different than what we see in the NBA. So Wake Forest, I think, could have a possible. Again, like, I'm being wildly speculative about what this union process might look like and what the wage negotiation process with the union might look like. But Wake Forest is always going to be behind the ball with regards to NIL. And so, University of Georgia signs guys to certain contracts, and then they use NIL to subsidize their existence in Athens. I don't think that's surprising. But what you're bringing up, I think, is an important point, is that if I'm going to be a fan and follow this, like, I have to think that there's got to be some measure of fairness in this. And this is where the NCAA has to be really, really careful in terms of regulating NIL, is that if they don't go far enough, then all of a sudden there'll be questions about, like, what's NC State doing to get these guys in the door, because that suggests that there might be, pulling a fast one on the NCAA. If the NCAA goes too far, I could imagine some schools breaking away from the NCAA, especially in football, and just being like, we're done with you. We're done with your regulations. Well, just the other day, I would agree with you, but just the other day, they made LSU vacate a bunch of wins from about 10 years ago. So, I look at decisions like that, and I'm like, what are they doing? Because you would think that an LSU or a Georgia would be like, let's just let NIL be kind of laissez-faire, right? Let's let free market principles guide this, and then they take away wins from LSU, which is really, that's really saber rattling on a member that is going to be really important to the NCAA moving forward. If it wants to still be the NCAA. Oh, sorry. You're the moderator.
All good. No worries. Michael, I know you had a question, and you had your hand raised earlier, and then we'll come over there next.
The teams that are going to win, that are going to get the best player, what are they doing right now to prepare for this? What are the best NIL schools doing?
They are. I think you need to look at Arch Manning's recruiting at Texas when he went to Austin. And this, I think, is something that Charlie Baker, the new head of the NCAA, has said, this is not going to happen anymore. But when he went to Austin, he not only got the tour of the school and got to meet with the academic coordinators and the other players, there was also time for him to meet with folks who were going to offer him commercial deals. That's what the best schools are doing right now. And if you're going to tell LSU or you're going to tell Texas that you can't do this anymore, there's one or two paths for that. You either tell them they can't do it and let them do it so that you maintain them in the umbrella of the NCAA, or you penalize them and they'll tell you to go to hell. Like, we're forming our own football league. At the minimum, that will happen. Like, the NCAA doesn't have anything to do with big-time football anymore. They get no revenues from it. They haven't for the last 40 years. The worry would be, like, we're going to pick up all of our sports, and we're not even going to be in the NCAA anymore. We don't need your basketball tournament. We're not going to have a women's gymnastics team that competes in the NCAA. We'll do our own thing because we're tired of you telling us what to do. To me, this is the smartest thing that a lot of schools could do, is that you make football a professional endeavor that's tied to the university, right? So I'm going to Neyland Stadium and I'm wearing my orange and I'm still singing Rocky Top, but it's owned not by the athletic department. It's not coordinated by the athletic department. It is a private entity of itself, and that way Title IX is not a worry in terms of what the athletic department is putting out to subsidize football and women's softball. And so that's another driver, I think, of where we might be headed in terms of like divorcing the schools from the football program.
So Todd, to build off that, a school like the University of Florida, their athletic department is technically a foundation. They're not state-run. They are separate entity. So could we see a similar model to that just for football?
Yes, absolutely. That would surprise me in 10 years that we don't see that.
And would they be able to keep their 501c3 status?
Probably not. I would guess that would go out the window. But again, the trade-offs of this are really, really severe. And the athletic departments have to be really, really careful about what sort of risk they want to put on the books with regards to running a football team, because that's a risky endeavor.
We'll send it over here.
When do we start calling those college sports? Well, I did with a couple of years ago. I studied because you have your university athlete getting full rights. At Nebraska football, it was $69 an hour wage if you counted what they were doing to earn that scholarship.
Right.
Creighton basketball is $90 an hour. You know, what's going to happen to the rank and file to say my kid is only going to be able to make $15 an hour at Starbucks, but somebody that is not even going to school, representing the school, is making 90. Is that not enough for that athlete?
So there's two criticisms I would level at that. One is the school is saying that the value of the scholarship is this, but I can't take that scholarship and trade it on a market. So I don't really know what the value of the scholarship actually is, because someone can't buy that from me. It's not fungible. So Wake Forest can say that the value of the scholarship is this, and then we could figure out what like a per hour wage is. But I would say, well, you can't buy a car with that because I can't trade it. So I would be skeptical of that. The other point, though, that is really important, and this goes, I love this, the way you frame this, like college sports, like what does that mean? What it's become is a really sad state of affairs where the NCAA has said that students need to have 12 hours a semester of progress in order to be eligible. And so what's happened at a lot of places is an entire apparatus has been created to maintain eligibility in a way that is farcical and sad with regards to higher education. So students aren't able to take the classes they want. They're not able to major in the things that they want, even though during the recruiting process, they've been told that they could do this. So they've been sold a bill of goods. And they're taking classes that, frankly, they're not interested in. They're too busy to take. The level of responsibility that a Division I athlete has these days is shocking to me. The travel, the practice, the year-round commitment to what they're doing, it continues to flabbergast me. And I have a letter jacket from Miami University from the mid-'90s because I could swim butterfly above average. I had a hard time doing that. I could not do what they do. And the vast majority of them are fairly successful in the classes they take. They're very serious about it, and they're balancing like really, really strenuous, stressful activities on the side. Making college sport a more professional model as opposed to a college model, I think would be really advantageous, because the kids could then, especially in football and basketball, they could just be athletes for a little while. And if they wanted to take a course or two to bone up on writing or math, so that after college they could be college students, after their athletic endeavors are done, they could go be college students, I would think that would be wonderful. But the fact of the matter is, we're not letting them be college students anymore. And the real benefit that I see to the students, but also to the universities, is we could get rid of the charade. And I'm not saying this is at Wake Forest. I see this from things I've read at other places. Again, like I don't represent Wake Forest athletics at all. But we could get rid of the charade that accompanies the idea of college sports, because there's a lot better way we could do it right now. Kind of a GI Bill for college athletes.
I'm going to send it back to Wes now.
Todd, in many respects, the difference between private and public institutions on the surface of this very topic creates a lot of chaos. Because a private school is administrated in a completely different way than public institutions, especially when it comes to tax-included dollars. Do you ever see a day where student athletes at a public state university are qualified as employees?
Yes. And I'm not a legal expert, but this case that's winding through the courts right now, which it's Johnston v. NCAA. Kid was a Villanova, just quick, he was a Villanova football player, which I think is 1AA.
FCS, yep.
And he's sued, and he's kind of a named plaintiff, saying that like the amount of time that I have to spend on this is not consistent with this being just an extracurricular activity. It is me being a worker, and I need to be compensated as such. Given what the Supreme Court did a couple of years ago, given how Wilkin ruled in federal court, given the way that the judge discussed the case when it was heard about 6 weeks ago, I would be shocked if in the next couple of years we don't get to a point where we have to call these people workers.
Do you think that will regulate or leave it in the hands of the states?
I don't have any idea. I really don't have any idea. State laws regarding workers are going to be precedent for this. There might...
Union states and you have non-union states.
Sure.
And you also have like public institutions with tax dollars.
Well, you have, I mean, every state can recognize a union. You just have states where you don't have to pay to be part of the union. Thank you, Justice Roberts, for that. That was a point I made earlier. I don't have any idea how this union, if it ever forms, is going to be organized geographically. But at the end of the day, I don't see much difference between private and public schools in this if they want to form a football team or a basketball team.
Well, one point that could be different for state institutions and non-state institutions, pensions. If you're a state employee and you're earning funds that could be recognized as pension earning positions, giving you a head start if you were to land a state job of some sort. So can state pension funds even handle that?
I would say yes, but I also think that part of the collective bargaining agreement could be that you get a pension as well. So, and I don't think that matters with private or public. Like if you're part of the College Football Union or the ACC Players Association, part of your agreement might be that you're eligible for a pension.
Let's see, you had a question right here in the front row, yeah?
So I know I'm taking this in kind of different direction, so I apologize, but we're seeing outside entities like Nike and Dr. Pepper and EA Sports who's
what I'm reading right now with regards to how the NCAA wants to operate moving forward is that they want to make it more difficult for those sorts of agreements to take place. So let me give you a really simple example with this. That to an economist, this popped out when I was reading an article about Nick Saban going to Washington, D.C. to lobby lawmakers about like a blanket NIL federal law. One of the things that was stated was that the NCAA would like to have a uniform contract for NIL deals. Now, that means that like a one-size-fits-all, the way that I read that is there's like a one-size-fits-all NIL deal contract. And if we go back to how I think about these agreements, like these are risk-sharing agreements. There might be really simple risk-sharing agreements where like I'm the center on the football team and the local car company wants to pay me $500 4 times a year to go sign autographs. Like that's a pretty simple contract. However, if I'm Paige Buchers and I have like an equity-based interest in an athletic apparel company, that contract that I just mentioned will not cover that agreement. And so if I'm the athletic apparel company and I want to enter into an NIL agreement that is going to be like equity-based for one of those athletes, and I have to use the uniform NIL agreement, I'm looking at that going, that's not going to cover our risks. We need to have a more complicated contract. So I read things like that, and I'm like, they're trying to make it harder for NIL deals to come forward. The North Carolina legislature about 2 months ago did such a thing too, where they basically said, look, any NIL deal needs to have language in there that basically says, if you sign this, you might be giving up your eligibility. Like, that's just nothing but like threaten. Like, so that's just threatening language that might scare away a kid from entering into some sort of an agreement that could be, somewhat profitable to him or her. So I look at the way that the NCAA is handling this, and they're really trying to find ways to just increase the cost of making these sorts of NIL deals because they've recognized like this is a substitute to their revenue generating model, and we would like to have those agreements back because this has made our job a little bit harder.
Todd, you made a point that I'm going to send to the gentleman in the back who's standing, so I didn't want you to think I forgot about you, but you mentioned North Carolina. North Carolina has had a little commotion here lately when high school NIL started getting discussed. So how do you feel like that is going to play a role into everything that's going on? And do you feel like the younger it starts, the better it could be because maybe it'll sort itself out as you move up the ranks, or is this just going to send everything into complete chaos?
I think this is let me say 2 things. One, when I hear about what's going on in the sports world in terms of like labor negotiations, I always try to take that and transpose it into another world, like a more germane world. So for instance, the North Carolina basketball player who we all think is going to be in the NBA one day gets a local deal. And there's worries about eligibility for college. If I put that and said, that Stacy, who works at the Dairy Queen in Statesville, is going to have issues about going to college because she's making ice cream cones and she gets this deal on the side to, model or whatever, that sounds really weird. That sounds really weird to me. And so, I don't understand the legality of limiting high school players or limiting their eligibility, nor do I understand the decision to do that other than we don't like for them to be taking our revenues. I've forgotten the second point I was going to make. But these high school deals are just kind of weird. No, to police them are kind of weird because why would we police high school people who have talents in other places from earning extra money? Like I don't understand that. But it's weird to us because our reference point is, and this goes back to the earlier part about this is psychology. Our reference point is this could be problematic, and I think we just need some time to change that reference point.
The gentleman in the back.
Back to paying players and making it a business activity, from a bureaucrat's perspective, is the risk for a player not that if the university, if an athletic department pays those person employees, they can then fire them, and as they then get better, let's say a freshman comes in and exceeds his perceived worth to the athletic department, is a much better player than they might be recruited. And he could, in theory, become too expensive, and they fire him, and you bring in a younger player who doesn't have as high as his value, and you is that a risk, theoretically, from his family's perspective, is that a risk of athletic departments controlling the process?
That would be a risk that the athletic department might have to, it would certainly have to consider. And one of the things that COVID has done is like lifted the scales from our eyes in terms of possibilities, and this is just isn't for sports either. But like a lot of people are entering transfer portals. So, you know, I go to State Tech U and I sign a contract for X amount of dollars, and I turn out to be better than what I am. And can I then go into the transfer portal and get a raise by going to a more high-profile school that might have more money or a spot for me? Can I renegotiate the contract at the school that I originally signed for? I think these are all things that like would have to be mapped out with a collective bargaining agreement that would really tell us what the rules of engagement are going to be between the athletic departments and the athletes.
But in the standard labor contract, that would be the risk, would it not? Well, it sounds great to a student athlete, hey, I can pay you, unionized the employee. Is that not at its fundamental core the risk the player has in the
I mean, they already can. Like they're already losing scholarships at much more probable rate than what they were 30 years ago. So, like I see this as we can either give you a check and some fringe benefits to this, and you enter into a risk agreement in terms of your quality, or we're going to have a scholarship model, and I can pull the scholarship at any time too. So, I mean, to me, that's almost an apples to apples situation.
We've got time for one or two more questions. So, Michael, I'll let you take this one.
I was wondering if you could speak to the donor booster side of things. You mentioned early on that you think athletic department revenues will go down as NIL goes up, which I think makes total sense. Are there dangers on that end of allowing boosters to pay or pick players, giving them that autonomy?
Yeah, to me, this is a really fascinating point, because if you are someone who has enough money to be betting on the future productivity of 18-year-olds, I wonder how you got that money, because I can't imagine a dumber thing to do than bet on the future productivity of 18-year-olds. But if you have that money, you're probably pretty shrewd, and you probably don't want to lose. So this is where the market would, I think, in the long run, really start to take hold, is that you would start to see people recognize that there are bets that I could make that would have a better probability of paying off for my commercial interests and for State Tech U than other bets that I might make. So I at the end of the day, like, I wouldn't want the car dealership down the road recruiting for me. But I think the car dealership down the road is going to be pretty smart in terms of, eventually, in terms of how it is offering NIL deals to potential athletes.
Dave Clausen says, before, if you're a car dealership and you want to offer, you're in any business and you want to offer money to one of our players because you see them out in the field, that red yard, you may want to check with us, because that kid may not be everything you expect him to be to represent your business. So I wouldn't go rogue with it.
I think that's right. Like, this is, as someone who is around 19-year-old males a lot, like, I would not want to bet on their future productivity. That is not a world in which I would want to have a stake in. So I think
College coaches do it all the time.
I know, and I
literally make a
I'm
living on it.
One of my best friends is a former college coach, and I asked him why he got out, and he said it's because I could not stand to be around, to have my worth be judged on how 20-year-olds are performing.
I have been told that I need to end the official panel. However, Todd will be available for one-on-ones here for a few minutes.